On a freezing morning in the middle of World War II, high over the European sky at more than 8,000 meters, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortress staggered through a storm of fire. Inside the shattered cockpit, the pilot was badly wounded, blood flooding his eyes and blinding him. Thin, freezing air rushed in through the blown-out windshield, as if trying to freeze every breath. The B-17, long known for its extraordinary toughness, now faced its greatest test, bringing the entire crew home safely despite mounting damage and severe injuries. At 26,000 feet, a miracle does not take the form of light, it takes the form of a decision. When blood covers his eyes and the formation has disappeared behind him, who will see in his place to guide this many-ton machine across the sea, find the right runway, and touch down without turning the entire crew into a single dot on the map? In the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe was entering its most brutal phase. Every day, heavy bomber formations of the United States Army Air Forces lifted off from fog-shrouded airfields in England, crossed the English Channel, and pushed deep into the European continent to strike key targets of Nazi Germany. At the center of this strategy stood the B-17 Flying Fortress, a name that was not merely propaganda, but something forged from steel, aluminum, and the belief that this machine could endure what humans could not. Many B-17 seconds returned to base with their airframes riddled with wounds. Some were punched through by thousands of bullet holes and still stayed aloft to the very end. Each hole was not just torn metal, but the mark of flak fragments and enemy machine gun fire, a silent testament to the violence of the European skies. Yet it was precisely here that the legend of the B-17's toughness collided with the ruthless reality of war. No matter how resilient it was, the greatest threat to the Flying Fortress and its 10-man crew remained Germany's dense anti-aircraft fire. On the way to the target, especially deep inside enemy territory, bomber crews were almost never truly safe. Hundreds of 88mm flak guns pointed skyward, forming an invisible wall of fire calculated to hit where the aircraft would be, not where it was. Exploding shells filled the air with clouds of razor-sharp fragments, saturating the sky itself. Pilots often described the target area as a ceiling of black flak clouds, so dense they believed they could smell cordite through their oxygen masks. Records show that the city of Bremen alone was defended by more than 250 anti-aircraft guns guarding its factories, a figure that makes clear one thing: the flight to the target was never an ordinary mission. For those who sat inside the aircraft, every bombing mission felt like a journey with no promised return. B-17 crews typically flew at altitudes between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin that survival depended entirely on oxygen masks, and temperatures could drop to -50 degrees Celsius. They wore fleece-lined flight suits and flak vests, moving slowly under the weight of heavy gear, fully aware that a single piece of flak piercing the cockpit or a 20mm cannon round from an enemy fighter could decide the fate of the entire aircraft in an instant. At that altitude, there was no room for mistakes, and even less room for hesitation. War would prove this lesson again and again. There were pilots and crews who fought until their final breath simply to keep their aircraft flying. One such story tells of a B-17 named All-American, nearly torn in half after a collision with a German fighter, yet still flown back safely by its crew. Another tells of a radio gunner like Forrest Vossler, riddled with shrapnel, blood flooding his eyes until he was nearly blind, who continued firing to protect his comrades. These were not legends embroidered after the war. They were recorded in mission reports, engraved in medals, and preserved in the memories of those who survived. Together, they shaped the legend of the B-17's endurance and the courage of young airmen who entered the skies with few illusions, but with an unyielding will to survive. And it was within this unforgiving context that our story begins, not as a singular anomaly, but as a representative, documented situation, where the line between life and death was measured in seconds by the person gripping the control yoke and the voices behind him. At dawn that day, While the ground in England was still wrapped in fog and the runway lights had barely gone dark, a formation of B-17 seconds from the 8th Air Force quietly lifted off from an airfield in the east. One by one, the heavy flying fortresses rose from the ground, reformed their positions in the air, and turned their noses toward the European continent. Our B-17, which we will call Spirit of Freedom, held a central position in the V-shaped formation, surrounded by more than 24 steel machines pressing toward a target deep inside Germany. Outside, the temperature dropped to nearly -60 degrees Celsius. The sky high above was a deep blue, eerily calm. Inside the cockpit, the pilot, a captain in his early 20s, tightened his grip on the controls, feeling his thick gloves slowly stiffen with the cold. Beside him, the co-pilot, a young lieutenant from Texas, silently checked the gauges and switches. Both men understood that these familiar routines were about to end, giving way to a stretch of sky where there would be no room for error. Behind them, the rest of the crew took their positions. The navigator bent low over his chart table. The top turret gunner and the nose gunner strained their eyes against the sky, while the waist gunners checked each belt of ammunition for their machine guns. Today's target was a fighter aircraft factory in central Germany, a vital link in Hitler's war machine. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew the area was riddled with hornets' nests, places where anti-aircraft guns would be waiting to greet them. When the clock struck exactly noon, the B-17 formation began its approach to the target, and the fragile calm shattered at once. Below, small black dots appeared among the white clouds, sparse at first, then multiplying rapidly. It was the first wave of flak. Within seconds, the sky ahead turned into a maze of black bursts as 88mm anti-aircraft shells detonated, closing in around the bomber formation. The explosions boomed against the aircraft, shaking the entire airframe as if someone were hammering the steel skin from all sides. In the forward compartment, the pilot and co-pilot felt as though they were flying through a twisted thunderstorm, one where every bolt of lightning was a lethal blast detonating just meters away. At that moment, the bombardier's voice cut through the intercom, firm and cold. "Target ahead. Open the bomb bay doors." Beneath the aircraft, the bomb bay doors slowly swung open, revealing rows of bombs hanging in place, ready to drop. And then, everything came apart in the span of a single heartbeat. Boom. A black flash tore through the nose of the aircraft with a brutal crack. The B-17 lurched violently, as if it had slammed into a massive wall of stone. An anti-aircraft shell had detonated directly in front of them. Shrapnel sliced through the plexiglass in the nose and ripped into the cockpit. In an instant, the windshield shattered completely. The co-pilot managed to scream once before falling silent, a fragment striking him squarely. His body collapsed where he sat, his hands falling limp. The pilot was thrown hard, as if hit by a direct punch to the face. A jagged piece of metal lodged itself above his left eye, punching through his goggles. Pain and dizziness washed over him as hot blood streamed down his face, flooding his eyes and mouth. Gunpowder smoke poured into the cockpit, making him choke. His ears rang, leaving only the shriek of wind and the chaotic roar of the engines. The flight map in front of him caught fire, acrid smoke spreading quickly. The instruments shook wildly. The massive B-17 rolled sharply to one side and began to slip out of control. In the next instant, everything happened too fast for deliberate thought. The pilot was stunned, half sitting, half slumped in his seat. His vision nearly gone, he blinked again and again, but all he could see was a dull red haze of blood. Instinctively, he reached to his right and felt the motionless body of the co-pilot. The wound had been fatal. There was no doubt about that. In that moment, he grasped a simple and brutal truth. If this aircraft still had any chance at all, he would be the only one keeping it in the air. He clenched his teeth and pulled back on the control yoke with everything he had. The B-17 did not respond. Instead, it pitched forward and dropped into free fall. The altimeter needle spun downward, and in that terrifying moment, the image of the crew behind him flashed through his mind with brutal clarity. If he failed to regain control, all 10 men would be lost. That thought alone kept him from giving up. Even as blood clouded his eyes, he lunged sideways, forcing the co-pilot's body away from the jammed controls. The lifeless weight of his fallen comrade pressed against the secondary yoke, making the aircraft even harder to handle. He had to brace himself, pushing and pulling, struggling for what felt like an endless few seconds. Finally, the body slid aside. He hauled the control yoke back toward him, every muscle in his arms tightening with pain. The B-17 shuddered violently, screaming in protest. The altimeter plunged, 25,000 feet, 22,000, 18,000. The aircraft was still falling fast. In the fuselage behind him, chaos reigned as well. The sound of violent impacts echoed through the airframe. Oxygen masks were torn from the faces of some crewmen. The intercom system went dead, its lines severed by the blast. No one knew exactly what was happening in the cockpit, only that the aircraft was diving at a terrifying speed. Several gunners in the tail and waist positions lost consciousness as their oxygen ran out. At this altitude, just a few minutes without oxygen was enough for hypoxia to bring a man down. In the tail section, the tail gunner staggered through darkness and thin air, searching for a portable oxygen bottle, slamming into the shaking fuselage as the aircraft plunged. Ironically, the very fact that the B-17 was dropping lower now offered a fragile chance of survival. The lower it fell, the denser the air became. Back in the cockpit, the pilot's desperate effort finally began to show results. The aircraft slowly clawed its way out of the deadly dive. After falling nearly 3,000 meters, it began to slow and regained stability at around 12,000 feet. His heart pounded, cold sweat running down his spine. Looking outside, he saw that the formation was gone. Spirit of Freedom was now alone in enemy skies, an isolated and dangerously exposed target. He blinked his burning eyes and wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve. His vision was still badly blurred. His left eye saw almost nothing. His right was smeared with blood and tears. He understood that he had temporarily lost his sight, but he was still conscious and still capable of keeping the aircraft flying straight. And that was when his thoughts turned to what came next, the crew. With the intercom dead, he grabbed a signal flare and fired a single red burst toward the rear, calling someone up to the cockpit. A few seconds later, a figure emerged through the hatch in the floor, the navigator, a first lieutenant. The scene froze him in place. Shattered glass, icy wind tearing through the cockpit, the co-pilot dead at his seat, and the pilot, his face smeared with blood, still gripping the control yoke with both hands. No explanation was needed. The navigator dropped to his knees, bracing himself to help steady the aircraft while checking the pilot's wounds. Blood was still running from the gash on the pilot's forehead. He tore off his personal cloth and pressed it into place as a makeshift bandage. The freezing wind blasted through the cockpit, making them both shiver, but it also helped clear the pilot's head. He shouted over the roar of the wind, "How are they back there?" The navigator raised 2 fingers, signaling that 2 men were dead. The weight of that news lasted only a moment before it was pushed aside. 8 others were still counting on this aircraft. The pilot motioned again. "Check the wounded and assess the plane." The navigator nodded and disappeared back into the main fuselage. By now, Spirit of Freedom had left the target area behind. The black bursts of flak were thinning in the distance, but the danger was far from over. Falling out of formation meant the B-17 had become an ideal target for German fighters. Engine number 2 on the left wing was completely dead, and engine number 4 was coughing smoke. The aircraft could no longer hold its former speed or altitude. The pilot was forced to descend, both to ease the oxygen strain on the crew and to buy whatever time he could. He knew that if they did not clear enemy airspace soon, it would only be a matter of time. The growl of engines to the right confirmed his fear. 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds were coming in fast. Spotting the lone B-17, they attacked immediately. "Fighters to the right, 2 o'clock, the top turret gunner shouted. 20mm rounds ripped through the air. The American gunners answered at once, streams of .50 caliber fire carving lines of flame across the sky. One Bf-109 was hit, its cockpit glass shattering, forcing it into a steep dive to break away. The second swung around toward the tail, but the tail gunner, wounded and barely hanging on, held the triggers down. After a furious exchange, the German fighter burst into flames and vanished into the clouds below. For a brief moment, Spirit of Freedom had bought itself a few more minutes of life. But as the adrenaline faded, reality asserted itself with brutal clarity. The aircraft was gravely damaged. One engine was dead, another close to failing. Hydraulic pressure was gone. Fuel was leaking. The radio was destroyed. The landing gear was jammed. The fuselage was riddled with holes, some large enough to fit a car through. Only the central load-bearing frame was still holding the aircraft together, keeping it from breaking apart in mid-air. Spirit of Freedom now resembled a wounded iron bird, struggling to beat its wings just long enough to reach home. Inside the freezing cockpit, the pilot squinted toward the west. The sun was already dropping, weak light spreading across layers of grey cloud. England was still hundreds of kilometers away. The aircraft could no longer climb back to altitude. He understood there was only one option left: stay low, accept the risk, and keep going. The decision came without hesitation. No bailout. If they abandoned the aircraft now, the wounded and the unconscious would have no chance. The order was passed by word of mouth. Everyone stays. No one objected. Spirit of Freedom pressed on toward the west, slipping through broken cloud. A few groups of German fighters harassed them, then broke off. At last, after more than 2 tense hours, the English Channel came into view. Hope flickered, only to be tested once more when engine number 4 caught fire. The pilot dropped the aircraft down to wave-top height, preparing for the worst. Then, like a small miracle, the flames died away. When the English coastline emerged in the fading light, the final SOS signal was received. 2 P-51 Mustangs were sent out to escort them. The pilots stared in disbelief at the sight of a shattered B-17 still flying. At a coastal emergency airstrip, rescue crews were already waiting. Then, with the last of his strength, the pilot brought Spirit of Freedom down for a belly landing. Metal screeched against concrete, sparks spraying outward. The aircraft skidded, shuddered, and finally came to a stop. A strange silence fell, before cheers erupted. Spirit of Freedom was home. The B-17 lay motionless on the runway like a steel beast that had finally stopped breathing, smoke still drifting from a burned-out engine, metal ticking and cracking like the echo of a struggle just ended. From a distance, no one could understand how it had made it back at all. The fuselage was riddled with holes, the left wing torn open, the right wing scorched, the nose barely recognizable, and yet it was the silence that was most frightening, because if the aircraft had endured that much, there was only one question left. How many of the men inside were still alive? The answer came in a way no one would ever forget. Rescue crews and firefighters rushed forward, then stopped short as crew members began climbing out through gaping holes and emergency hatches, as if stepping out of an aluminum coffin that had not quite closed. One by one, 8 young airmen, filthy and bloodied, were helped down to the ground amid thunderous applause from those watching. 7 were still on their feet with only light or moderate injuries. 2 were badly wounded, including the tail gunner, and were quickly placed on stretchers, and when the full picture became clear, the moment felt almost impossible to believe. The entire crew, except for the copilot who had been killed in the air, was alive. They had come through an unimaginable journey and carried their lives back with them. Doctors later examined them and counted countless small fragments embedded in their bodies, yet none had suffered a fatal wound. One sergeant gunner laughed and cried at the same time, gripping the aircraft commander's hand as if afraid that letting go would make it all vanish, and said through broken breaths, "If we'd bailed out back there, I'd never have seen you guys again." But even as the others were being pulled from the aircraft, one man had still not left it. The pilot, the aircraft commander, was the last to step down, as if he would not release the sky until he was certain his crew had been safely handed back to the ground. He barely made it off the aircraft before staggering and collapsing at the nose, not from weakness, but because there was nothing left to give. The wounds to his head and eye, combined with the blood he had lost, dragged him down like a final line being cut. Medics rushed forward, catching him as he fell. They removed his flight helmet, hastily bandaged the injured eye, and injected him with a painkiller. In his dazed state, the first question he asked was not about himself, but about the men behind him. "My crew, are they all right?" When he was told, "They're alive, they're being taken care of," he finally exhaled, allowed a faint smile, and let the doctors carry him toward the field surgical station. Before slipping fully into unconsciousness, he murmured, as if speaking to himself, as if speaking to the aircraft that had carried them home, "We made it." Tears ran down the smoke-streaked face of the 25-year-old pilot, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of having stood on the edge and come back. Once the crew had been taken away, the rest of the story belonged to the mechanics and technical officers, men who measured war in numbers and damage rather than fear. Even they stood in silence. The inspection that followed left everyone stunned. More than 300 holes of every size scarred the fuselage of Spirit of Freedom. The nose was almost completely destroyed, the cockpit left open and ravaged like a room torn apart by the wind. One bomb was still lodged in the bay, its release mechanism jammed. That detail alone was enough to make seasoned men shudder. A single deviation, and the aircraft would never have reached the runway. The main fuel tanks were riddled like honeycombs, yet somehow the remaining fuel had not ignited. Engines number 2 and 4 were completely destroyed. Engine number 3 was operating at barely half power. Electrical systems, radio, oxygen, hydraulics, nearly everything was dead. The most experienced mechanics shook their heads, speaking as if confronted with something beyond reason. There's no way this iron bird should have made it back. The B-17 was famous for its toughness, but damage on this scale was usually enough to tear an aircraft apart in mid-air. And yet, Spirit of Freedom had held together to the very end, bringing 8 men home to solid ground. One technical officer stared at the surviving frame and said quietly, "That really was a flying fortress made of steel." On the far side of the runway, their battle was not over. It had only changed its setting. The crew was rushed straight to a military hospital. The tail gunner had survived by the narrowest margin, but his severe wounds condemned him to long days, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the rattle of stretchers rolling down the corridors. The pilot, the man who had kept the aircraft in the air at the cost of his own future, remained hospitalized for weeks. Surgeons removed dozens of metal fragments from his body, including one lodged deep near his eye. The injury was too severe to repair. His left eye could not be saved, and he lost the sight in it forever. It was a heavy price, yet he spoke of it with a calm that left others struggling to find words. "Losing an eye is nothing if it means saving my crew," he would say. That attitude moved the doctors and nurses deeply, because they had seen too many men who survived physically but never truly returned. Thanks to his strong constitution and iron will, his recovery came quickly. Within 2 months, he was able to walk on his own again and began speaking to young pilots, sharing his experience as a way of giving back what he had been given, the chance to live. As the story spread, it ceased to be only about one aircraft and became something larger, a symbol. The U.S. Army Air Forces held a ceremony to honor the crew. Every member received the Air Medal and the Purple Heart for the wounds they had endured. The pilot, for holding the aircraft together and saving his men in a situation that bordered on the impossible, was awarded the Medal of Honor by the President of the United States, the nation's highest military decoration. He became one of the very few bomber pilots to receive that honor during World War II. Yet, even as the medal gleamed under the cameras, he spoke with the same quiet humility, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I just did what needed to be done to bring my men home." And in his own mind, the greatest reward was not the ribbon on his chest, but the fact that 8 men had stepped down from that aircraft alive. As for Spirit of Freedom, it would never fly again. The damage was far too severe to repair. The wounded aircraft was dismantled for parts, its service ending with 19 mission stars still painted on its fuselage like scars carved by time and fire. And yet, in a strange way, an aircraft does not always need to fly to keep serving. Its remains became a testament to the resilience of the B-17 under fire. And among those who had flown with it, it earned a new name, spoken softly in gratitude, the Lucky Fortress, because it had carried so many men back from the edge of death. From that day on, its story lived not only in mission reports, but in the way young pilots looked at one another before takeoff. If a B-17 that shattered could still make it home, then perhaps today they might have a chance as well. Not every moment of World War II was recorded as a victory or a defeat. Some moments existed only for a few hours in the sky, where a single human decision carried the fate of an entire crew. The story of an American pilot, badly wounded, temporarily deprived of sight, yet still resolute enough to fly his B-17 safely home, belongs to moments like these, quiet, uncelebrated, but preserved intact in history. It became a symbol of courage and the bond of comradeship forged under fire. At the fragile boundary between life and death at 26,000 feet, the young pilot chose not to abandon his aircraft or his crew, despite blood blinding his eyes and pain stretching on second by second. That decision did not come from heroic slogans, but from a simple and unforgiving resolve. As long as he could still control the yoke, he was responsible for bringing everyone home. That choice is what made the miracle possible. The B-17, shattered like a bird with broken wings, still completed its final mission, carrying its men back to their homeland. Looking back on this event, what inspires awe is not only the extraordinary toughness of the flying fortresses, but the limits human beings can surpass when pushed to the edge. Aircraft were built from hardened metal, but it was the crew's will and courage that became the true steel forged in war. History is filled with stories that seem impossible to believe. Aircraft returning with tails nearly torn off, with thousands of holes in their fuselages, or landing safely even after the pilot had lost part of his body. Each story is more than a feat. It is a cold reminder of human endurance under the harshest conditions imaginable. Spirit of freedom did not end in victory, but in the simple fact that it lay still on the runway and that the men inside were alive to step down from it. War rarely allows that outcome to repeat itself. Behind this single flight were countless missions that vanished into clouds and fire, aircraft that never touched the ground again, and men remembered only in a few brief lines of loss reports. For that reason, when a crew does make it home, it is never just luck, but a fragile intersection of trained skill, discipline held to the very end, courage that refuses to let go, and decisions made in a few seconds that separate life from death.